What's going on, guys? Welcome to In the Zone. I'm your host, Garrison Roy, and today we're going to talk about being in the zone, actually in the strike zone. But before I get into that, if you're new to the episode, hey, we have different segments or shows within the show, so to speak, right? Rants where I just kind of go on, vent, rant, ramble, right? Certain topics. And then also full length interviews. Those are conversations with experts, athletes, or coaches that help guys stay in their zone, and also those mental minutes, the quick mental hacks to help elevate your performance, and then deep dives, those your educational explorations into subjects, and we get into the really nitty gritty there. But again, if you guys ever want to have any questions answered, or maybe even certain topics covered, have a guest on that you might be intrigued about, want to learn a little bit more from, hit me up. Put it in the zone podcast 123 at gmail.com, or text us in the description below if you are on a platform that allows that. And that goes to my podcast platform, and I'll answer all your questions. But for today, came across a really cool article. And obviously, as we're preparing for the World Series, there's going to be a lot of comparisons and, probabilities of Yankees versus Dodgers, right? Coming up here. But uh, obviously, behind the dish, you have two different catchers, Wells and Smith. Okay. And there's been some controversy among the catching community. And I do think it does influence a lot of the pitching community too, but they just don't realize it. Is how catching has evolved, right? And I'll put this article in the show notes for you guys to dive fully into that and read it. But I just kind of went over and had some spark notes, but I wanted to share with you guys and talk about a few of the little intricacies and nuances that may or may not have been overlooked. I think they did a really good job of laying most of it out and kind of digging into the past statistically, but also just kind of how the game has evolved as a whole. And obviously, I'm sure catching has definitely evolved. If you look at the very first catching mitts, back super early on up until Yogi Berra, and then Johnny Bench went and had a completely different glove, right? And then how that's evolved in and of itself. And Johnny Bench was actually one of those first ones to not be super traditional all the time with his stance or how he was set up in the zone, right? But recently, there's even been more of a drop off with less guys in that traditional, squatter stance where they have one leg down or one leg kicked out, you know, totally different types of points of view there. But they have some statistics on this because it's been done for quite a few amount of pitches throughout the seasons. And I'll just kind of break down some of these stats. So obviously, Wells, right, he's down on one knee 97% of the time, left or right. Okay. Smith is down 94% of the time. It's pretty significant. Hey, these two big leaguers are catching with one knee down. I think the whole you should only catch from a traditional stance is kind of debunked. But again, these are professionals. So maybe if you're first starting out to catch, maybe you learn how to do that and then learn how to move around and move your body to learn how to block. Again, teach their own. I'm no catching expert. I'm just kind of laying out some facts and how things can kind of interplay and, you know, affect the game in it itself, right? Wells has a 82nd percentile, or like basically top tier level of blocking. However, what's really interesting is Smith, what they talk about in the article, he is like the bottom five of this past year in 2024, statistically, right? As far as being able to block guys. But Smith catches more runners, right? Whereas recently he used to be a really good blocker, really good framer. But now that's gone down. And he even quoted in the article where he's focusing more on trying to catch runners because the running game is kind of, you know, taking a spike really with this whole pitch change. I think, in my opinion, him shifting that focus or that intention caused a lot of these other things like his framing or just overall blocking went down. However, Wells on the other side, he still blocks really well, but he's shifted to having more of that left knee down a higher percentage of the time, right? And now it's pretty crazy. Like one in every 10 pitches are caught in a traditional stance, which is really nuts, right? And some people have the argument of like, oh, hey, well, there's runner on third. Maybe you still need to stay in a traditional stance or keep it where you're at. But to be honest, they're actually pretty close to the same since the beginning of baseball in 1919, whenever they started having all these stats, which is actually kind of wild. I don't know how they kept the stats of all of that, or if they went back and looked at old films of some of the old games there. So I don't know how true that statement is, but that's what was said in the article. So I was like, okay, cool. But now there's fewer pass balls, and um, one of the greats, catcher coaches who was with the Rockies, and now I believe he just transitioned. I can't think of where he's going right now. I want to say it's the Cubs. Yeah, I think that's right. But he was even like, hey, like because of all this change and how much the catcher has influence of a ball that goes past the hitter if they don't hit it to the catcher, 90% of those is more of how they receive it that would influence either a pass ball or not. 6% of that is blocking, right? And then another 1% of that is just the overall throw, like you have your wild pitches and whatnot that you just can't really do anything with. Or maybe they're just trying to get up and make that transition and they couldn't, get the guy out or have a called strike. I don't know. Uh, Essentially, 90% though of that being receiving, I would think, and this is just me, if I'm a catcher, 90% influence, I'm going to work on a lot of the receiving versus the actual blocking. But I think it's interesting if you go back and look at the article where Will Smith's also framing went down. Maybe, and this is just my kind of deductive reasoning with some of those rule changes, right? The umpires can have a little bit more influence of technology as far as calling balls and strikes. Maybe he doesn't really care to frame it because he knows that that's already there. So it's like, hey, like all these little pitches that are about a ball or two off the plate, there's really no point in trying to frame those. Can you steal a couple pitches here and there? Yeah, definitely can. Um, but I'm just curious to hear like if I had a conversation, sit down with him, like, hey, why do you not frame as much as you used to? Maybe it's unintentional. Maybe it's just something that has happened for this past year because of his focus shifting to more of the runners. But obviously, league wide, fastball percentage has gone down as well. And like I mentioned before, runners are stealing a lot more. So makes sense. Okay, so that's like on the statistic in the game side. But now, as far as performance and health for the catchers, obviously, if you've been a catcher before or know someone that catches, they always complain about their knees, having to squat down, getting up, and getting back down. So you know how hard that can be on their body, right? And one catcher in the article says that he has a really good amount of dorsiflexion, right? Which is be like if you're standing tall and you put your knee over your toe, that's dorsiflexion, right? So when you squat down as a catcher and you have a really good movement of that, which I do, I can kind of just sit down there and squat and hang out. Although I was left-handed and I didn't really catch other than Little League, didn't really benefit me that much. But it does have a play with a lot of that being, your overall physiology on what might work better for you. And having that one knee down from a lot of guys, they said that it helps reduce a lot of the back stress, right? So if they have this weird butt tuck as they go down to the bottom part of their squat or whenever they're resting there, and that's where that back in the past when I was growing up, they had those knee savers to try to really save your back and your knees to be able to get up and bounce up out of that and then throw the runner out or even just go, you know, field a ground ball or go get the pass ball, whatever the catcher might need to do. But that, again, whether they have really good ankle dorsiflexion or really good, hip mobility to be able to move around, shift around, and block the ball, that's a huge factor. And I'm not saying that that should completely influence how someone sets up, but if someone has a little bit more hip internal rotation or external rotation, they're going to set up a lot differently for certain pitches. With all that being said, though, you also, as a maybe on the flip side of that, as a pitcher, right, you kind of have to know what's going to be more beneficial. Sometimes catchers can see everything around them, but they may not know, like, oh, hey, I set up a little bit more outside, and so I'm losing that outer half or inner half part of the plate or outer half part of the plate wherever the umpire set up to his left or to his right. And the pitcher can kind of relay that and be like, hey, every time you set up on the outside part of the plate, the umpire can't see because your helmet's in the way and he's squatted down there with you. So maybe if you try to turn to the side, have one knee down, you can expose that a little bit more, right? There's certain things that catchers can't really see. He might notice, but sometimes umpires might set up on the left side or they might set up on the right side, depending on where the catcher goes. And that's just a mental note for you to kind of talk about in between innings from pitcher to catcher, right? Having that battery, uh, connection where it's like, hey, like this is what happened here. Hey, he's given us a lot more up in the zone, maybe not so much down in the zone, or maybe he's squeezing us, right? Whatever you guys might talk about, it's just the reality of where it is. But you can also use those to help play it to your advantage within the game too, right? Um, but it is also really interesting how all of this is coming together, helping you guys stay in that strike zone because that in the middle of the game, in the heat of it, that's really what matters. If you're throwing balls, if you're, you know, not staying locked in, it's going to be really hard to win, right? It's going to be really hard to stay focused and put your guys, your team in the best position to win or maybe even field a ground ball or whatever it might be, right? Um, But yeah, feel free to check out that article. I think it's super interesting. I want you guys to also pay attention more of that when you're watching a game. Maybe notice a little bit more of what the catcher's doing versus just kind of everybody kind of focuses on the pitcher and their mechanics and how they're moving, the pitch movement, right? But just be a little bit more attuned. That's the right word, right? Be a little bit more aware of those setups, of how the umpires set up and how in different situations how that even changes. Seeing if maybe one guy's legs out. Oh, hey, what pitch was that? Was it an off-speed pitch on to more the outside? Does he have a tendency to miss more to that side? And that's why maybe he has that to where he's able to shift around. Has a lot of context clues to be able to learn and have a game within the game while you're watching it. So appreciate you guys listening in. Please share this with someone who you might know who needs the help stay in the zone.